It's interesting when you look at the history of our profession that in the beginning, when interpreters were working in the consecutive, they were right near the speaker. And then in simultaneous, they found themselves behind a glass. And now with remote interpreting, they'll be even further away. So how can you work in those conditions? I think we need to adapt to that. And I think it's also interesting to turn to our history to figure things out also for the future. This picture was taken last year when we had the Nuremberg exhibition paying tribute to the pioneers of simultaneous interpretation. Actually, at the time when Simultaneous was introduced, a lot of experienced interpreters had big doubts about Simultaneous. They thought that, while it would not work very well, that they wouldn't be able to do their job in decent conditions. But we all know with hindsight, of course, that this was the beginning of our profession, the way we know it today, that the number of international meetings skyrocketed, interpreted meetings, and this was, of course, brought about by another disruptive technology at the time. The progress in sound technology made it possible to have meetings with simultaneous interpretation. So we now are heading towards a new setup, and this, again, is something that's quite new for many of us, and the profession finds itself at crossroads again. But we need to be open about it. We also need to be careful and vigilant. We need to know what's out there, and we need to be organized to do that. And that's precisely the reason why AIIC was established in the first place in the 1950s. To get organized, to define working conditions, a code of ethics, and also working conditions such as the size of the booth and sound quality and so on. And we tend to forget today that if we work in such good conditions, if we had such good sound quality, this is to a large extent attributable to AIIC. So we should be thankful to AIIC for all these achievements that we have tended to forget.
I will start by giving you a short introduction to distance interpreting. And you might wonder, why do we talk about distance interpreting and not about remote interpreting? You will see later on that there are differences in terms of definitions, and it's quite useful to know what we're talking about before going more into details. I will show you some distance interpreting settings and different technical setups to put this into practice. I will also talk about some of the technical parameters and the ISO standards and the requirements that are formulated in those ISO standards when it comes to technologies in the first place. I will, of course, also show you or give you some information about existing RSI platforms as we have them on the market. And if I say on the market, this is basically what we would find on the European market. As I'm based in Europe, in Germany, maybe our perspective is a little bit Eurocentric, as it is maybe always in AIIC or quite a lot in AIIC. But we have the great opportunity to talk to representatives of other regions today also. And Naomi, for example, is one of the people that maybe have much more experience with remote in general, and that can give us some insights on how this is being dealt with in other parts of the world, specifically in the United States. In the end, I will show you some trends that we can observe on the market right now, not only in terms of technologies for simultaneous interpreting, remote simultaneous interpreting, but also in terms of what is happening in the events industry. And if we have a look at the events industry, we will see directly what are people talking about right now, how are events being organized, and what are the major, let's say, the major concerns for event managers and for participants at events. And maybe there is a link between this perspective and our perspective, and we will see if this matches or if there is still some gap there. As I already said, if we as interpreters are sitting in the conference room together with the audience and with the main speakers, and there's only one speaker connected from a distance, or it can be several speakers, then we would call this audio conference interpreting if it's without visual input, or video conference interpreting if it's with visual input. I don't want to give you my opinion on what audio or video, or if video is better than only audio or whatever. This is not my intention during this presentation now. Maybe this afternoon in the panel discussion, I could give you more of my personal opinion on this. This shall be a more or less neutral perspective I will be showing you right now. Now, following the AIIC definition I gave you before, this kind of scenario would not be considered remote interpreting, but it would be a subcategory of distance interpreting. If we have a look at what I showed you before, this kind of scenario, in this case, we as interpreters were on site where the event took place, but we were sitting in a room next door. Not in the same room with the speaker and the audience, but just beside, for very different reasons. In this case, this would be video remote interpreting following our AIIC definition. If the interpreter would not be on site where the event takes place, but all the other participants are, then we would only have an indirect sound and image input for the interpreters, and that's where we would talk about video remote interpreting if it was with video. This might be performed, and with this I already go into some more details about concepts that are being used nowadays. This can be performed in a hub or studio, or this can also be performed in a so-called home office. Again, without giving you my personal opinion on this, we will see later on what the implications are using one or the other. And then we would have a situation where everywhere is somewhere spread around the world, which means that no one is co-located with no other participant at a communicative event. These are things that are happening more and more on the market, on the events market, virtual meetings, no one co-located with no one else. In this case, again, we would only have an indirect input, so we would be talking about video remote interpreting, and again, this could be performed also in a hub or studio, or it could be performed in any kind of office. Yeah. Let's have a look at the technologies that by now are being used to put this in practice, these kind of different scenarios. You will find in the audio-only modality, you will find telephone lines or basically voice over IP, which is the digital modality of telephone nowadays. You will find also web conferencing solutions. Web conferencing solutions can be, for example, applications like GoToMeeting, like WebEx, these kind of things, or Skype, which also is something that is used quite frequently. The important aspect in this context is that these web conferencing solutions work with different protocols. I don't want to go too much into technical details. Just keep in mind there might be some different protocols that are being used, and maybe there is an incompatibility between different solutions. Video conferencing solutions, video conferencing which came up already some 20 years ago. It was being used quite frequently in many bigger companies for board meetings, for example. And there, the important aspect is that these video conferencing solutions work with so-called codecs in order to encode and decode the data that is being transmitted from one to another. And if you work with such a video conferencing solution, all of the connected points will have to use the same codec in order to be able to communicate. What we also find are so-called broadcast solutions. They are basically a point-to-point communication, a direct point-to-point communication, And in many cases, you will find multiple transmission technologies that are being used in parallel with a certain redundancy. So if there is a loss of data on one of those lines, you can take this lost data from the other line and compensate for the loss. You will also find here a dynamic monitoring and controlling of this transmission. So there is someone who really is monitoring this transmission of data and who can directly influence this by influencing the parameters and controlling what is happening on the transmission lines. What we find right now, and this brings me to the platform solutions that we will be talking within a couple of minutes, is a so-called hybrid solution, where you have a combination of web conferencing or video conferencing. It's basically web conferencing, sorry. That one went wrong. And what they do is that they add features of these broadcast technologies. And of course, they add, when we talk about interpreting, the distribution of the interpreted channels to the audience, as well as the transmission of audio and video input to the interpreters. So it's a combination of different technologies that is basically being used right now. Now, the important thing for me, and I will always underline this and point this out, is that providers, clients, but also interpreters, very often in the discussions about remote interpreting, make no difference between simultaneous and consecutive mode. But there are fundamental differences between those two in terms of signal processing, in terms of frequency range, for example, that is necessary in order to be able to perform in simultaneous mode. It is different from consecutive mode. We will see later on why and what exactly this means. The equipment that is needed for consecutive is different than the equipment for the simultaneous. And in terms of cognitive processes, again, this is also something different for us as the ones that are performing these services. Now, with the digital systems that basically are being used nowadays, you will hardly find any analog systems anymore. It's basically digital technologies. You have very different possibilities of putting into practice, thank you very much, of putting into practice remote simultaneous or remote interpreting in general. One of the things that seems important to me is that we might have our own perspective as interpreters, of course. We should always try to maybe change a little bit the perspective and see this through the eyes of the other stakeholders that are in the game. And in the end, every one of those stakeholders, including us, of course, will have to decide on the appropriate setup for his or her purposes. The questions that arise, and I will only name a few of them because later in the panel discussion we will have more possibility to go into more details. The reflections you can make or you should make in this context is who is in control of the environment? Is there a control of the environment? And when I talk about environment, this refers both to the general setup with all the different parties that are involved, but also to our own working environment. Who is in control of this? If you work in your home office, for example, it should be clear that you as an interpreter will be more responsible at least for what you find there as an environment, and you will have to control this environment to a certain extent. What happens in terms of liability? Who assumes liability for problems that might arise, for data losses, for whatever? And who will be making the investment in the necessary equipment to be able to perform in remote simultaneous interpreting modality? I will now give you some information about the home office configuration, just to make you aware of some of the important aspects related to this. First of all, these home office solutions, and I don't want to, actually I don't like the term of home office, because it could be any kind of office, any kind of room, which would not be a booth, which is the traditional way of performing simultaneous interpreting for us as conference interpreters, at least. Any other solution that would not be a booth is not yet addressed in any ISO standard, for the simple fact that it's just still too new to us. So there was not enough time yet to really address this and to have any kind of standard on ISO level available for it. Home office solutions are widely used for the delivery of interpreting services, for example, in the healthcare sector. I think we will hear something about this from different participants today. If you have a look at the United States, for example, this is a very, very frequent way of delivery of interpreting services, that the interpreters are not sitting in a kind of studio hub, or however you want to call it, or on site, but they are performing from their homes, which has something to do with access to services, with flexibility, with being able to react in a direct way on a specific need that might arise from one second to another. Yeah. The important, of course, there are very different specifications for this kind of solution you will find on the market. The important thing to keep in mind is that if you work in such a scenario and there is no one else with you who takes care of you in technical terms, for example, you will only have a very limited control of the technical environment. You will also have a shift of the responsibility from the provider of the conference equipment, which basically is what is happening in a traditional on-site scenario, to the interpreter, because it will be your equipment, it will be your office and the environment with all it includes, and you will have to assume a certain responsibility for this. On the other hand, what we find on the market, and some of these studios have been appearing during the last, I would say, a couple of months and years. These studio hub configurations are also not yet addressed in any ISO standard directly. You will find in the ISO standards always the reference to a booth, be it a permanent booth or a mobile booth, but that's the typical setup you would find there, and nothing else. These studios by now are mostly working with hybrid solutions. Hybrid solutions, which means that they will still be using traditional hardware consoles, for example. They will still be using booths that are set up in a room. And for us as interpreters, in terms of equipment that we directly have to manipulate, there is not a big difference when we compare this to an on-site scenario. If you have a look at the specifications that those providers of these kind of studios or hubs are giving to the interpreters or to their clients, you will see that they work with very, very different specifications, which also causes some problems because if you talk about a studio, this might look very different between one and another. The important thing to keep in mind in this context is this studio, if it's well equipped, if it has everything that we need in order to perform in a remote modality, is only one part of the whole scenario. You also have to keep in mind that there will be other people connected from a distance, and also those points that are connected to this communicative event need to be addressed. So you can have the best equipment ever in your studio with everything you would need. If a single speaker makes use of the wrong equipment, the wrong microphone, for example, and is connected from a distance, and you get this audio signal, and you should be processing this audio signal, you will have problems. Yeah. So we have to see this as a whole system. I know that the providers of the existing solutions don't like this very much, and they like to say, well, our solution is for transmitting the data, and we have no influence on which kind of equipment is being used by someone else, a speaker at a distance. Yes, that is true to a certain extent, but I think that doesn't help us, because in the end we will all have to suffer from substandard equipment that is being used by anyone who is connected to this. Now, to give you an idea of what is happening there and what in technical terms is being made nowadays, this is a drawing that shows the typical setup basically of one of those providers, but if you have a look at the solutions of the others, they are more or less similar. You would find in such a kind of studio with a hybrid setup, you will still find the traditional booth. You will find hardware consoles that are placed in those booths. And the difference is now that these signals that are coming to your console or from your console for the audience, they are basically fed into laptops, into devices that then transmit this data into a public or private cloud. And it's very important to see that I mention here public or private. When we talk about cloud, a cloud is not always the same. A cloud can have very different technological background. Public or private, which includes that there are solutions where this cloud is only being used by the one who is authorized to use it and who has a control of this cloud or on this cloud. On the other hand, you will have speakers, just as I'm talking to you right now, with any kind of microphone, and also the signals coming from this microphone would be fed via sound card or whatever it is into a system, and from there into the cloud. Into the cloud. And from there, these signals can be distributed to either the interpreters, of course, as audio and video feed, or also to the audience. Now, what these providers are, or some of them, are promoting quite a lot is to get rid of this traditional equipment and to directly eliminate the consoles and replace them, putting those laptops directly into the booth. So as an interface, you would not be using a hardware console anymore, but you would be using a laptop with the specific software running on that laptop, which gives you more or less the same functionalities as the hardware console has been doing until now. What many of those providers are promoting quite a lot is to get rid of the infrared transmission technology for the distribution of the interpreted channels to the audience. That's what we usually have. There might be some differences, but in many, many cases, nowadays we are still using infrared. They want to eliminate this infrared, and they want to give the audience the possibility of using their own devices, be it a smartphone, be it a tablet, be it a laptop. There are different possibilities. As you are distributing this data via a cloud, everyone who has access to this cloud can get those signals and can hear the interpreted channels. That's the idea behind it. And that's one of the main arguments they are using in terms of cost savings for clients. No need anymore for infrared and the devices that are quite expensive. Yes, you have to rent them or you have to buy them. Everyone brings his or her own device and you get rid of all this equipment. It's not that easy actually, because there are some pitfalls when using this kind of technology, but that's what you will find. So bring your own device is one of the concepts that is being applied quite frequently nowadays. Let me give you some information now on the standards that we are dealing with when it comes to remote simultaneous interpreting. First of all, there are a series of standards that I hope you all know, because they are not really new, at least two of them. ISO 2603 and 4043 have been on the market for many decades already, and as Sylvie pointed out before, it was due to the hard work of AIIC colleagues by that time that we got those standards. And these standards are the ones that are being used basically worldwide. These standards, and this is important, have been revised in 2016. And some of the content of ISO 2603, which is on permanent booth, and 4043, which is on mobile booth, have been moved to new standards now. This is the case for the equipment being our consoles that we are using, microphones, headphones we are using as interpreters. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind. You won't find it anymore in the booth standards, permanent and mobile, but you will find it in the ISO 2109, which is a new standard that was published in 2016 and which deals specifically with equipment, but for simultaneous interpreting explicitly. We're not talking about consecutive interpreting. Another new standard that was published in the context and which is kind of one of the elements of the set of 4 standards is ISO 2108, which was published in 2017, only last year. And this one also addresses simultaneous interpreting, but specifically setting the requirements on quality and transmission of sound and image input to interpreters in the first place. It's the first standard that includes distance interpreting. It makes reference to distance interpreting. There are some requirements specifically for distance interpreting in a very generic approach. It was the first step. It needs more development in the future, and we will be seeing more detailed requirements for distance interpreting in the future. In addition to this set of 4 standards, you will also find ISO 22259, which is about to be published. It's actually, it is done, it is ready, it's lying in Geneva in the office of the ISO Central Secretariat, and unfortunately, those people take quite a lot of time in publishing the final standard. It is a standard on conference systems and requirements for conference systems. In the beginning, this was meant only to address traditional conference systems when we talk about interpreting, because a conference system can, not necessarily, but can include an interpreting system. Basically, a conference system is set up with discussion units for the people that need to communicate with each other. You will find things like loudspeakers and things like that that are part of this conference system. If there is an interpreting system as a part of the conference system that is being used, then you will also find these requirements in this ISO standard. And in the very end, when we already had almost finished it, we managed to open the door in that standard for remote simultaneous interpreting technologies. Why? Because until that point, this ISO standard on conference systems was including a hard reference to ISO 2109, which would have meant that only hardware consoles, physical hardware consoles, would have been allowed. As we all know, these are technologies, the software-based ones, that are in use. And we thought it would be very important to address them and to open this door in order to prevent a development on the market without any consideration on ISO standards level. So this hard reference was taken out, and now the next step will be to find a solution or a standard for exactly these new technologies. And that's why we decided to go for a project on new technologies for simultaneous interpreting. I don't like to see this new here in front of the technologies, but anyway, that's what the group decided to do in the end. It's new for simultaneous interpreting to a certain extent, but it's not a new technology in general, or these are not new technologies. You will find requirements and recommendations there, and specifically requirements for cloud-based solutions. This will be, that's the intention. We don't know exactly if we will manage to do it, but our intention is to publish this already next year. It will not be a full standard yet, comparable to the 2603, 4043, and 2109 and 2108, but it will a so-called publicly available specification, which is kind of an intermediate step when you don't have reliable data yet, enough reliable data yet, but you feel the need on the market for giving orientation, guidelines, by setting requirements, basic requirements, and giving recommendations, you can opt for a publicly available specification. It's a specific type of deliverable on ISO level. And that's our intention. It takes much less time than a full standard, and we would have it by autumn next year. That is what we are planning right now. A part of this, of course, we will need to talk about remote interpreting in a very generic approach, because this is only technology. Remote interpreting or distance interpreting includes a whole lot of additional aspects. And these shall also be dealt with on ISO level. This will take much more time, of course. And there will be several working groups of ISO on ISO level who will have to work together in order to make this happen. We will see how this goes on. What we will be doing is that we will immediately go for a revision of this ISO 2109 on the equipment, making it possible that requirements for software-based equipment are being introduced in this standard. Yeah, this slide, unfortunately, I still have to show it. I very much hope to be able not to show it again ever, but unfortunately, the ones who were present in Valencia at the AIIC assembly are maybe aware of the fact that there was one resolution, it should have been taken the decision to eliminate or to modify Article 7 of our Code of Professional Ethics, which by now allows us to work from screens only in exceptional cases. As we have seen before, at least on the private market, and this is coming also on the institutional and the agreement market, this is not an exception anymore. We can't talk about an exception anymore. But this is still what our Code of Professional Ethics says. So if we are working in remote simultaneous interpreting modality, we should know that there is an issue with our own Code of Professional Ethics. Now, as we have a new executive committee on AIIC level, and these people are quite reasonable, they did understand that we can't just go on pretending we have a Code of Professional Ethics and this is only an exception or whatever. And that's why we had the publication of the so-called position paper on distance interpreting. And I highlighted some of the most important aspects in this position paper. First of all, AIIC recognizes the importance of the ISO standards, which is quite important to my understanding, but the ones that are related to conference interpreting, of course. We are still an association of conference interpreters, and that's why we will be addressing conference interpreting in the first place. Now, the important, or the question that directly arises from this statement is, what is conference interpreting exactly? And where does it end? Where are the delimitations? This is something which is quite an interesting exercise. We are trying to do this exercise on AIIC level right now, trying to find this definition because it's quite unclear. For many years, basically AIIC colleagues thought they would know exactly what conference interpreting is. Of course, we are the professionals. The problem is when you really ask people, try to explain this and try to make the difference between this and community interpreting, legal interpreting, healthcare interpreting, you begin to struggle. It is not that clear, unfortunately. So this is one of the exercises we will have to do. And this position paper says that distance interpreting modalities must meet the applicable requirements of those ISO standards. Not all of them are directly applicable to remote interpreting. If you, for example, have a look at a hardware console, you will find buttons there, obtrusive buttons, as they call them in ISO language. A software-based solution, a software running on your laptop, will definitely have no obtrusive buttons. So even if this is a hard requirement that is set in the ISO standards by now, you simply won't be able to be compliant with it. So this one can't be applicable. We will have to have a look at what is the functionality of this button. And is this functionality there? Is it available for interpreters? And then this begins to make sense. You will also find in this position paper that we say something about the working conditions and that the working conditions that are being formulated for distance interpreting need to be adapted to each specific modality, which is quite challenging, to be very honest, but this is what we find in the position paper by now. We also included in this position paper a statement on independent and objective research that shall be the basis for any kind of working conditions that we set. The problem is, and that's why I put those question marks here, the problem is that there is very few independent and objective research that has been done on distance interpreting in general. We have some studies, yes, but we are still lacking of really large-scale studies, reliable data in order to really be able to say this is like that or this is not like that. It's basically our own experience we have. And this experience can be very different between you and me, for example, or between different interpreters. What AIIC says is that it supports systematic and methodological testing of distance interpreting modalities in real work environments. Yes, this is a good approach. And therefore, the task force on distance interpreting has been created to carry out this work or to coordinate this work. So far, the standards and what AIIC by now has as let's say, as basic texts for distance interpreting and dealing with distance interpreting. Now let's have a look at our workplace. In the first place, the one that we are used to working in as conference interpreters. Question for you, short reflection, what kind of workplace do you have right now? I think all of us will immediately be thinking about, no, not about this, but about this. Yes, this is one of the booths, and I have chosen this example not for making any publicity for this specific provider of booth, but because it's one of the providers that is really ISO 4043 2016 compliant. You will find a lot of booths out there on the market that are not yet compliant with the new revised standard. I can only recommend you to have a look at what kind of booth are you being offered there, and specifically or especially for the consultant interpreters, to keep this in mind. These booths, or booth according to the revised standard, have some advantages in terms of ventilation in the first place. which was one of the real issues we have with the mobile booth. Also in terms of lighting in the booth, in terms of space available, the desk, and things like that. So it's worth having a look at ISO compliant booth. Something that we find, maybe not that much anymore in Europe, but in other parts of the world, is something that is definitely not ISO compliant, which would be this kind of booth. I included this in this presentation to make you aware of the fact that providers of these kind of booths make reference to the standard 4043, and it's quite interesting to read here that it is incorporating modified ISO standard 4043. What does incorporating mean? And what is modified? Yes, I mean the first modification is that's half the size. Some things are missing there, definitely. Yeah, but that is one of the problems we have right now because there is no certification body for providers of booth. So there's no official certification that would be available for us, and therefore these providers, they say, yeah, we are compliant, or as we see here, we are somehow compliant to a certain extent, but not fully, or whatever. Yeah? So you have to have a closer look at the details of these technologies that are being offered, especially when it comes to tenders also, or these kind of things. Then you can imagine that the price of this in terms of rental is quite different from the one that it would be for the fully equipped booth. Okay. You might have been thinking when you made this reflection now about the hardware consoles. You find here two of the latest models that came to the market, 2109 compliant consoles. There are other providers also. I only put two of them here. And you might be thinking about some additional features, which are a part of booth of console, a headset you will be using in most of the cases, lighting, a desk screen for video input, a laptop you will be using maybe as support, water for lubrication of your voice, yes. Here we go. And you will also find front and side windows in those booths. And what are they for? They are for communication between interpreters and maybe a technician, in order to not to have to run out directly. So communication seems to be one important aspect in this context. Chairs, yes. In general, furniture and equipment, yes, definitely. You will find it on one of the next slides. Thank you. Now the question is, do we think, or do you think that a remote workplace can or should be different from the one we are used to until now? Now, some of you might be thinking of something different. Some of you might be thinking of exactly the same. Yeah? So this is one of the fundamental questions we have to deal with. If we make that exercise, and I try to do this for you to give you some information on what is out there on the market, the traditional one is the one we've seen before. And now, in maybe a new setup, or this booth could be replaced by any kind of room, as long as the ISO requirements are met. The console, the hardware console, might be replaced by an interface with a software. Again, as long as the ISO requirements, the basic ones, are met. A headset will still be a headset. Important, it needs to have the same specifications as the headset that we are using together with our hardware consoles, which is basically something that we don't control in many cases. It's just been given to us by the provider. But interestingly, A lot of colleagues like to bring their own headphones with them into the booth. I will give you some quite interesting information on that in a couple of minutes. Lighting, yes, there are ISO specifications for lighting. The desk, exactly the same, screens, a laptop, water, front and side windows. Now, front and side windows, as we don't find them anymore if we don't use a booth, we can ask ourselves, how can we communicate with each other? With the other booth, for example, or with the technician. What you will find on the market is basically by now that a text chat is being used for replacing this direct communication. I don't want to judge right now whether this text chat is an adequate solution or not. That's simply what you find on the market right now. Something that is beginning to appear, and I just got an email, by curiosity, I just got an email this night from Brazil, from a colleague in Brazil, putting me in contact with a provider of this kind of hologram technology, which might also be one of the technologies being used for the communication side. Just to give you some ideas of what people are working on right now in this business. I think we all agree that on-site simultaneous interpreting is not the same as remote simultaneous interpreting. If it was the same, we wouldn't be sitting here and trying to find out what it is about and how can we handle this. Now the question is, shouldn't the basic parameters and functionalities be the same? It is a question, and I will leave the answer up to you. I have my personal opinion on this, but maybe there might be different perspectives on this. If we say that the basic parameters should be there, otherwise it wouldn't make sense to always ask clients to set up a booth, for example, when we perform in simultaneous, in conference settings, at least in simultaneous interpreting. If we say that everything that we have been doing in the last 30, 40 years was nonsense and it doesn't make sense to have a booth with sound insulation and things like that, okay, then the situation would be different. Yeah? So it's up to us to decide what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Now, in order to make this exercise, it's important to see what are those basic parameters. The obtrusive button, as I said before, is maybe not one of the basic parameters, at least not for people without disabilities. When it comes to disabilities, people that have problems with their eyes, of course, an obtrusive button becomes more important. If we have a look again at the ISO standards, we find some parameters there that I suppose could be the basic ones. Basic parameters are, in the first place, the so-called frequency response. This is going to be a little bit more technical now, but I think it's important for you to be aware of these parameters without really maybe knowing exactly what this means, but I will give you some information on it. Frequency response, in the ISO standards, it says that microphone and headphones, and now important not only for the speakers, but also for the interpreters, shall correctly reproduce audio frequencies between 125 Hertz and 15,000 Hertz. This requirement, in terms of frequency response, also applies to any kind of microphone, the one that I'm using, for example, right now, or any kind of microphone that is being used. The ones that have been working in video conference settings might have noticed that some speakers, what they do when they're connected from a distance is that they use their smartphones. Yeah? They're connected via telephone, mobile telephone. The problem is that the microphone that is included here, or that you connect to it usually, is not compliant with the frequency response we saw before in the first place. And secondly, when you transmit data via mobile phone, this is mobile telephony is something very different to what it would be when you have a direct connection in terms of frequencies you are being transmitting there. They are cut down to 7,000 to 8,000 hertz, which is the maximum if you have a really good quality, but they never go up to the 15,000. Yeah? And again, you will immediately have this additional effort you would have to make for listening. Any kind of source that is being used, like a laptop or also a video conferencing system, also needs to meet this frequency response requirement. Otherwise, the whole system will go down immediately in terms of quality. The responsibility lies with the AV provider, of course, but again, if we go for home office solutions, it is immediately the interpreter, him or herself, who will be responsible for using the correct equipment. And by the way, you can check your equipment even in a presence-based scenario. Have a look at what kind of headphones you are getting there. If you work at the EU institutions, you can be sure that these are compliant. If you work on the freelance private market, you will get a lot of different things there. Yeah, so have a look at it. It's worth considering it. Video conferencing microphones, an on and off and mute button. This is in terms of being able to control the signals, the audio signals. Basically, this is directly linked to microphone management in general. There is a requirement that says that preferably only one microphone shall be switched on. Why preferably and not always only one? There might be situations where two microphones should be open in order to even make it better for us as interpreters to listen. If you think about a discussion, for example, between two people, if you always have to connect and disconnect those microphones, the technician, as the one we have here up here right now, needs to handle this in question of fragments of seconds. And it's quite difficult, and we will be losing the first words of an intervention, for example, and therefore it might make sense to have two microphones open in this case. Someone needs to be able also to switch off microphones if the participants forget to switch off their discussion unit, for example. This can be controlled automatically in a digital system without any problem, but there needs to be someone who does this. Distant sound sources that we find in these remote scenarios need to be managed within the system. So you can't leave it up to everyone to control their own microphone. I mean, you can, but there is a high risk that this won't work in the end. Again, this is a responsibility of the AV provider on site. And it's also a responsibility of the platform provider. Microphone management, there should be a functionality included in those cloud-based systems just as well that gives you or them the possibility to manage the microphones and to switch them off if something happens during the event. Now, this is a requirement which is quite difficult to understand and to control for us as interpreters. It's basically meant for the builders of buildings, architects, and people that make the planning. The speed transmission index, they know exactly when you address them, they know what this is about, and you can at least address it, talk about it. With, for example, the provider of a conference room or whatever it is, they will know what you are talking about. What is important really is acoustic feedback and acoustic shock protection. Unfortunately, we had some cases where there were serious injuries being suffered by interpreters due to acoustic shock. There are technologies that can be used to prevent this happening. In Canada, for example, I was very glad to read that there are at least two solutions that are being recommended right now in order to avoid any kind of acoustic shock. This can be applied, of course, both for an on-site scenario where this can also happen, but in a remote scenario, this is more likely to happen because of the lack of control of every point that is connected. There are solutions, and we might include in the guidelines on distance interpreting from AIIC that will be published by the end of this year, an explicit reference to this acoustic shock and the measures that can be taken to prevent this. Image quality, of course, also something that is important if we say that visual input is important as such. The ISO standards say there shall be no visible artifacts. It's a very generic approach. We give there the example of blurring or freezing of the images. And we also have included a sentence saying that simultaneous interpreting might have to be suspended if these artifacts occur. This is something that the representatives of the EU institutions wanted to have in that standard, to give their interpreters the possibility and the right to say, not able to see enough anymore, we suspend the interpreting service. On the private market, you will, that's my personal experience, you will make a huge effort to continue performing until you come to the point where you say, I'm unable to deliver any simultaneous interpreting anymore. But it's good to have this. You can always refer to it. And yeah. AV providers, platform providers, and also interpreters are responsible for this, because if you don't complain about it and if you don't suspend simultaneous interpreting, yeah, you can't blame anybody for not having reacted and trying to eliminate the problems. Lip sync, one of the most basic requirements. There is a requirement in the ISO standards that says very clearly which are the values, the maximum and the minimum values that are the limits for sound behind image or sound before image. And this is nothing that we invented or we just said, oh, let's take these values. There are studies that were made by external people, not interpreters, not platform providers, nothing alike, that clearly say that these are the limits. Within those limits, you will not perceive this lack of synchronization. If it goes beyond those values, then you will begin to perceive it, and then, of course, it will cause an additional effort for you while performing in simultaneous mode, and therefore you will find those requirements there. Latency, also one of the basic requirements. What does it mean? It simply refers to when image and sound need to arrive to you as an interpreter in order to be able to process this audio and video signals in time, let's say, within the communicative event in time, in order to start performing and to deliver back your interpreted audio to the audience. In the ISO standards, we only addressed by now the first part of this transmission, which is from the source, where a speaker is speaking, to the interpreters. And it says there 500 milliseconds shall be the maximum delay between the generation of the audio input on site until you as an interpreter get it. Why do we have this? You can imagine that if we would have set this to 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, whatever, you might have to wait 5 seconds until you get it, and then you start interpreting, and then it gets transmitted back to the audience or to the audience wherever they might be, which adds an additional latency. And then people sitting in a room having a presentation by a speaker, for example, would be seeing a completely different slide at the moment when they get this interpreted channel on their ears. So that is basically the reason why these 500 milliseconds were introduced there. For the in the new standard, we will also include a value for the way back from interpreters to the audience, which by now the idea is to have exactly the same 500 milliseconds, which in total would sum up to 1 second, which is still manageable. It was quite funny to hear when we were in China at the last AIIC meeting that a Chinese colleague during the discussion stood up and said, we are right now having remote interpretation. I was told by my colleagues here in China, everything that is being spoken here and presented here is being transmitted to interpreters, and they are interpreting on remote. And they only have a delay of 8 seconds. It's excellent. Okay, yeah. This might be excellent if you, I don't know, if you have something where you can wait those 8 seconds in a realistic scenario to give your audience the possibility to follow really what is being said and what's being presented. I think we should definitely cut this down to a lower value. Speech intelligibility. I talked about this index before already. Now, speech intelligibility is basically talking about or referring to echoes or reverberation, as technicians call this. If you have a room like this, for example, this room is specifically designed for giving you the possibility of listening to me or to my voice, which is being reproduced by the loudspeakers, without having any echoing there, because it would disturb you while listening to me. And this is exactly where you have some given values. There is a standard, which is a standard coming from New Zealand. Don't ask me why New Zealand and not anyone else, but it doesn't matter because it's an international standard that is being applied right now. And you will find there values by room type and size. It's very different if you have a small meeting room to this kind of room, for example, or to a very big conference hall. Yeah. Architects, building planners know about this. Why do I mention this? Again, if we work in different rooms because of the remote modality, we have to consider this. And for example, to give a very drastic example, if you're working in your home kitchen, if you have the advantage of having a very big kitchen, the echoes that will be perceivable in this kind of room will be quite disturbing for you as an interpreter. And also this will be fed into the system, and then again, your audience will have, let's say, an alterated auditive or audible input. Yeah, to come to an end with the basic requirements, accessibility, of course, is something we have to address. Unfortunately, we have colleagues, or I don't want to say unfortunately, maybe even fortunately, we have colleagues and we have the privilege to work with colleagues suffering disabilities, because this can be something very useful for us as an experience. I have the big privilege of being in charge, technically in charge of a training course for blind interpreters, in this case speech-to-text interpreters. And I have to tell you that the experience that I'm making with them and the way they process audio signals, for example, is absolutely incredible. Yeah? It's a very big privilege to see what their brains are able to do if they are trained for doing this, by force, of course, which at the same time maybe gives us a hint on what are we really using in terms of capacity of our brains. I'm absolutely convinced, and there are studies that show this, it's not me, but yeah, that we only use a very, very small part of our brains. With training, with specific exercises, we might be able to perform differently in the future, taking into consideration new technologies. Just to give you an additional thing. No, I wouldn't go as far as that. But when it comes to working at the same time with different, let's say, with different devices, because that's one of the complaints of many interpreters is that if they don't have a hardware console, they are unable to work. They can't manipulate a soft console with the mouse or with whatever it is while interpreting. I understand this because we're not used to doing this. But I'm absolutely sure that you can learn this. And if you have a look at the younger generation and talk to them about these kind of things, they look at you and say, well, what's your problem? Yeah? So, yeah. Okay, there are a lot of additional parameters that are important. Here we come back to furniture and equipment. Yes, here you find it. Video displays and the positioning. The presence of a conference technician, yeah, the presence will be something in relative terms. You have to see it. He should be available. There should be someone that is able to give you technical support while working in remote modality. This can be sitting beside you in the same room, in a studio or hub, but this can also be from a distance with access to your device, for example. Yeah, as long as it's not your own personal device. Yeah. And this is a warning from my side. Do not work with your private laptops in remote modality, because you will immediately be giving access to the technical support to your own device. I don't want anyone to see what I have on my laptop. And I don't want to give access to maybe confidential data that I might be carrying that day on that laptop because I received an email with some confidential information. And immediately you give access to someone else. So be careful with this. This should be dedicated laptops only for these purposes and nothing else. And then things can run more or less smoothly. You will find something like a push to mute button. Yeah, you will see. I will give you an example of one provider that included this functionality only recently, which shows that at least they are considering some of our concerns. Outgoing channel pre-selection and selection, slowdown button, incoming message indicator, and system clock. Something we have on the traditional hardware consoles. These things should be available also in a software-based solution. It can perfectly be programmed to give you this possibility. But we as interpreters need to stress on the fact that this needs to be there. We need to ask for it. If we don't ask for it, it won't be there. It's as simple as that. Yeah, again, this comparison between the traditional and possible new remote situation, scenario, booth and furniture. We have ISO specifications for booth and furniture. Why should the chairs be different in a studio or a hub than they are and shall be in a booth? I don't see why they should be different. Video displays and their positioning. Maybe there we should have to find new specifications because of distance issues, because of new technologies in terms of projection of images that are coming to the market, involving screens, for example. I don't know if you ever had the chance to see such a thing. It's a screen that is really 180 degrees around you, for half around you, not 360, but only 180. And with the right projection, video cameras and things like that, you would even be possible to see in such a studio. You would be possible to see exactly the same as if you were sitting in a booth inside the conference room. Yeah. This is something for the future. Yes, I admit it costs quite a lot. It is expensive, but it is something that is being studied right now. Yeah, presence of a conference technician, I already mentioned this. This is basically remote support that is being given, or if it's a studio or hub, the technician can be sitting beside you just as if it was an on-site scenario. Push to mute button, exactly the same. Outgoing channels, pre-selection and selection, we have ISO specifications on this. A slow down button, we also have it, and this is also something that, for me, working basically on the private market, I have to admit this slowdown button has never ever been in use in any of the booths I have been working until now. Not only on the private market, yes, but I know in the institutional market that there are some people who make use of it. Yeah, and that's why it's there. Yeah. Okay. Incoming message indicator. This is also coming from the EU institution representatives. They wanted to have this incoming message indicator, and that's why we have some specifications for it. I think if we talk about chats for the communication between booth mates or between different booths, maybe an indication is something to reflect on. Yeah? Shall this be something audible or shall it be visual indication? This we will have to find out and we will have to see. A system clock, it might be very silly for you to read this, but if we are located in different parts of the world, who says which is the time that is exactly being used for the event? What's the event time? The time in Washington, the time in Berlin, or the time in Tokyo? Without going into details, liability and responsibility are definitely something we have to address. We will come back to this afternoon in the panel discussion. I can assure you this because we had this first round of discussions yesterday evening. I would only recommend to specify liability in your contracts and to make use of contracts. The African region told me that 80% of the work was being done with the Arab countries region, was being done without any contracts. Then it will be difficult to include this in a non-existing contract. Yes. We can give you some recommendations on the wording. This is a very first approach. You will find it in the presentation, and we can always send this to you if you ask us about it. Definitely you will need to find a way of dealing with it. And this is something new still. It's a legal aspect, and therefore we will have to develop appropriate solutions for it. What kind of questions can you make to people that ask you to work on remote? You can ask which technological platform is being used. Is it one of the ones that we know about, or is it a new one, or what is the technology behind it? Is this compliant with ISO 2108 and 2109? With the specifications you find there. Who will be giving the technical support during the event? How is the communication with the team partners and the event partners being carried out? Is it a text chat, or is there something different available? And liability, again, as I said before. Very briefly, internet connection bandwidth, because these are questions that are frequently being asked in these kind of seminars. What do we need? What are we talking about there? Now, remember, you will need 4 megabytes per second of bandwidth for every HD video feed, which would then include the audio. The audio is not really the problem. The problem is the video, because it's much more data that needs to be transmitted. This means if you want to have one video feed with the close-up of the speaker, for example, one video feed with the speaker on the stage with the environment, one video feed with the view on the audience, and one video feed with document presentation, more or less the 4 screens that we saw before from the EU Commission. That will sum up to 16 megabytes per second, but these need to be permanently available as download speed for you. Yeah? And if I say permanently available, have a look at your contracts you have here with your telecom provider. It will always say, if you have a normal, regular contract, it will always say up to 20, up to 50, up to 100. But you don't know what you will have there at the moment when you need it. if your neighbor starts downloading videos, large quantities of data, your availability, your bandwidth will drop down considerably. So this is important to know. RSI platforms, here's just a non-exhaustive listing of those. We will have more information on this this afternoon, also coming from the United States. You will find some of the solutions right now, indicating also if they themselves consider them as remote simultaneous interpreting solution, or if it is something different, only audio, for example, which is the case here. It's for audio conferencing and not including any visual input. How do they look like, those interfaces, to give you an idea of what are we talking about there, replacing the hardware consoles? This is one example. You have basic functionalities there as selection of incoming and outgoing channels. You have your microphone button. You have something like a handover from one teammate to the other if they are not co-located with each other. For the communication with your interpreting partner, you have a text chat and you have an additional chat with your event partner, let's say. And then here in this case, you would have two different video feeds, one with the speaker and a second one with the presentation slides. That is one possibility you will find on the market. Now, a second screenshot, I just took it this morning. This provider introduced a new functionality now, which is the cuff button. Before, if you have a look here, it just said off, and you had to press it and it was off, and you had to repress it again. Now it's a self-releasing button as we find it on the hardware consoles. Yeah? So apparently there are possibilities of making this happen. Another example with basically the same functionalities but with a different configuration on the interface itself. Different size also of the screens that are being used there, but basically, again, the same functionalities, but programmed in a different way. This is difficult to see, I know, but it is very similar to a hardware console. If you have a look at it, you will find more or less the same configuration than on a hardware console. This is one of the providers that opted for this specific design. Again, a different way of dealing with it. Few features directly available on the main screen, but a bar where additional functionalities are hidden behind, and you can click on it and then you have access to those different functionalities. This was also something we saw for the first time last week in Rome. It is a new kind of console, but it is a independent console. You can carry it with you. It can be connected via Wi-Fi or via Ethernet cable to basically any kind of system. It could work with those platforms we saw before. And it has buttons. And it was interesting, Aude Valérie, you were there. Immediately when they showed this, people began to applaud. Our colleagues began to applaud because they had their buttons again there. Okay, that's how it is. Yeah, just coming to an end already, we sent out an ISO compliance matrix to basically all those providers, asking them for data on their solutions based on the requirements as they are set out in the ISO standards. I don't want to read it out right now. That was what we sent to them. Some of them were very responsive, others less responsive, some non-responsive. Yeah, but we have data on them right now. What we can say is that none of the solutions that are currently available are fully compliant, even with the basic requirements. They will all still have to do some development if they want to claim to be ISO compliant. Yeah? Keep this in mind, ask them these questions, and the more often they are confronted with these kind of requirements from our side, the more they might be willing to introduce specific features. Trends. I promised you to give you some trends. This shall only show you that there are a lot of different technologies that are being expected, emerging technologies, that we will be seeing within the next few months or years. You will find there some technologies that have something to do with what we have been discussing until now or during the rest of the day. You will also see that we have ahead quite a steep curve in terms of number of new technologies that will be coming to the markets. And that's the only thing I want to tell you with this slide. Yeah? There will be a lot of technological developments that will come to the markets within the next few months and years. And we have to ask ourselves, has this anything to do with our service? And how can we deal with this? As trends in the remote interpreting industry, we are seeing an increasing number of remote interpreting providers, definitely. I don't want to say that every week there is a new one appearing, that would be too much saying, but definitely there are more and more people coming to the market. We see a consolidation of remote simultaneous interpreting providers. It's not that many of them, of the whole RI sector, that really claim to have a solution for remote simultaneous interpreting, because it's more complicated in technological terms. Hubs or studios are appearing, are being set up in different parts of the world. It's not a very big amount until now, but there are some. We will come back to this afternoon, I guess, during the panel discussion. We are seeing, at least in Europe and specifically in Germany, companies that are starting to look out themselves for compliant RSI solutions. And if I say compliant, we have the very big topic, the GDPR in Europe. Compliant in terms of data protection, confidentiality, and things like that. And compliant also with their internal IT guidelines. Companies in Germany are really enthusiastic about their own IT guidelines, and they are very much, they are paying a lot of attention to GDPR, which makes things quite difficult in some cases. International organizations and institutions, sorry, the S is missing, are calling for renegotiation of agreements. We have seen this from the Council of Europe. SCIC already got in touch with AIIC asking for opening negotiations on the future, and there are others too. The UN, some UN agencies are already using remote simultaneous interpreting platforms. One of the ones that I showed you, they made some first pilots with it, and we will be seeing more and more of this. It's a fact. Want it or not, that's what they all are studying right now. There will be a pilot being carried out in the Council of Europe within the next month, and we will see how this continues then. And in the MICE industry in general, we have a lot of live streaming. We have a lot of event apps that are coming to the market. We have a lot of digital interactive tools for participants. Yeah? It's not important to see the numbers there, just to give you an idea of what is happening in the events industry. And why do they introduce these technologies? They want to simplify the participants' management. Yeah? When they go to an event, they want to be able to manage their participation as smoothly as possible. Time efficiency, work efficiency, increase outreach, increase visibility of events, and satisfaction of participants. We should reflect on this, and we should reflect where is our role in this events scenario in general, and what does this mean for us, and what effects can this have for us, and why is RSI becoming more and more important, which is definitely the explanation here. Well, this is something that happened a couple of weeks ago. You will see here a reference to artificial intelligence, and there was someone thought he was quite intelligent using artificial intelligence and presenting this as if it was human simultaneous interpreting. Unfortunately, people got aware of this, and as this was in China, that guy had some serious problems. I don't want to call this a trend. That's why I put this in brackets here, but these kind of things happen, of course, when we talk about these new technologies. AIIC is very much trying to catch up and to do things and to be present there and to help membership. This shows the list of seminars that are being taken place. Today we're here in the Netherlands. Next week we will have a workshop in Germany, from the Germany region, where they will be talking about business models, new business models. There will be someone presenting remote interpreting from the personal experience. There's one colleague that performs in remote quite frequently. And there will be other topics related to remote. PRIMS meeting in London in January and an RSI seminar in Cyprus in February. And I'm sure there will be more of these. Move to Athens. Okay, thank you very much for this information. It's important for me as well. Yeah. We will publish guidelines on video remote interpreting in simultaneous mode in December. This is something that EXCO asked the task force to do. It will be a first version of that document. And this will be available, of course, for AIIC members, but also for other people outside the association. We will be carrying out a series of tests with RSI solutions, as I said before, in order to obtain reliable data. What we definitely need is more knowledge, more expertise, more cooperation, maybe appropriate structures and business models to see where this leads us to, a cooperation with industry and academia, visionary approaches, maybe not only think about next year, but think what will be the situation like in 15, 20 years. And then set up a strategy to go for this in the end. Input from all interpreter generations, not only the ones of my generation, for example, not only the younger generation, but all. We're all part of this game, and we need to include everyone. And a coordination, a much stronger coordination of activities within AIIC, but within the whole interpreter community as well. These were the results of the discussion we had in London at the RSI seminar. I just wanted to show this because this might give you now, and this leads directly to what you will be hearing in a second, to an exercise we ask you to make, to reflect on what are your concerns, what are the topics that you think that need to be addressed. This was the result of the one in London. At the end, let me show you a quote of the CEO of MemoQ, translation business, not interpreting basically, but translation business, but I think it's quite appropriate for us as well. Technology skill set is the barrier nowadays, not the technology itself, because it's there. You know? Yeah, is a reality, and so let's catch up and make the future together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Naomi, who is the president of DS Interpretation. You're based in Brussels, but your company is initially from the US, right? Mm-hmm. And your aim is to implement innovation while maintaining high standards, and in particular AIIC standards, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And, well, that's all I know about you, so I'm very curious to hear what you have to tell after what Sarita just said.
Yes, I have a lot to live up to. I'm really happy to be here today and honored to be part of this group and be able to talk to you, to provide a perspective from the market. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the global mobile workforce. That's what I call it. And yes, I live in Brussels. My company is based in San Francisco. And I have been working remotely for 20 years, vice president of the company for many of those years, and I took over as president of the company about 6 years ago. It's a big challenge to work remotely. So this perspective is where I'm coming from when I'm talking about the global mobile workforce and interpreting remotely. It's the experience I have the most with. So I want to talk about a sustainable approach to interpreting in this new tech world. How I see the market, it's going in two directions. Barry Slaughter-Olson, who many of you know, and I had a conversation a couple of days ago, and he called it the bifurcation of the market. And I absolutely agree with this. There's the side of the market which has a conventional approach, our on-site conferences that everybody is familiar with, everybody travels to, and new technology coming in and trying to replace the way that everybody has been doing things. The other side of the market is a new world. It's a new market entirely. It's the webinars, the virtual meetings, and these types of gatherings that require interpretation that defy explanation. I have many clients who have many of these events, and one of my biggest challenges is meeting the needs of these clients and providing interpretation. Conventional approaches just don't work. I can't send interpreters. I have so many examples of weekly, daily challenges. I'll just throw out a few. And we don't meet ISO standards when we do this, yet we're working with AIIC interpreters. We had a meeting in Corfu on a beach, 13 languages, no way to put 13 booths in the sand. There was a huge rainstorm about 3 hours ahead of time. We ended up using dressing rooms on this beach in Corfu that were about this big, and we had to put one interpreter at a time in these dressing rooms, and we used conventional equipment for that. But just as an example, how to meet the client's needs. I wrote a quote for remote interpreting this week as well. That is a setup where the interpreters would be dispersed, 2 of them working together in their house. That was a cost factor driven request. But in many cases, we have situations where we just can't come up with a regular solution. I have one I'm working on right now. The meeting is on November 28th. It involves 16 countries, 13 to 1,500 listeners, 250 connection points. So some of these locations have 200 or 300 people in them. It's 3 languages, Spanish, English, and Portuguese. And they are platform dependent. I need to come up with a working solution for them that allows them to use their current meeting platform specifications, which is Skype for Business. It may sound simple, but it's incredibly challenging. There's nothing simple about it. And I could go on and on. I have a long list of this. I have 3 from this week. So basically, there are 2 ways to view the market. There's the new market, full of new solutions that don't exist yet, and people are trying to develop technologies to match those solutions. And then there's our conventional market that people are trying to cut costs or provide new, cooler solutions or get rid of the headsets. That was brought up, BYOD. Let me tell you, BYOD is not an easy solution either. Think about battery life, think about earbuds, think about, oh, I forgot my earbuds, but I have an iPhone 8. How do I plug it in? Do I have the right adapter? All of these things, very, very challenging. There are no simple answers. So what I want to focus on today is that this new market, this new approach to our conventional market, it requires a new way of looking at the market from all of you. And I'm going to use the term business. Interpreters need to view themselves as a business entity and take a business approach to promoting your services in this new tech world. A business approach is market-driven. Your job as interpreters is you provide a service, and you need to respond to the market needs. And in this new tech world, how do you do that? You can drive the business market, you can help educate your clients, you can set the standards, but how do you do this? How do you make this happen? The risk, as Gaspar has mentioned, is being pushed on to all of you. And that is a primary reason why you have to view yourselves as a business and learn to mitigate that risk. That's what businesses do. Businesses take on risk. And in fact, California law defines a contractor as a business entity that takes a risk. That's part of the definition of being a business in California. So how do we deal with that? Well, there are lots of ways, and I'm going to get to Shannon, because I've got a lot of things to say to Shannon. There are basic needs that interpreters have. I came up with a little list of 3 a long time ago, and I was really happy to see the summary of comments and what people are concerned about. My top 3 are also your top 3. You want to be able to hear well. You want to be able to see well. You want to be able to share and communicate with your partner. Those are the top 3. And the 4th is liability. You're very concerned about liability and risk. So I view those as those basic needs that have to be dealt with when approaching new technology. If there are more and others that need to be on that little short list, I want to hear them from you today. So I haven't had a chance to go around and read everything, but I'm going to do that on these pieces of paper. So I'm here to learn from you. But those are the 4 top ones that I hear. Hear, see, share with your partner, liability. So how do we do that? Let's talk contracts. Everybody, in my opinion, should have a contract. I never work with any interpreters without having a contract between us. If the company that you're working with doesn't provide a contract, you should provide a contract. Sometimes there's going to be a negotiation and a back and forth on that contract, but always have a contract. And you're going to have to start thinking about how you charge, because the new technology market is really not going to be able to support the conventional approach of the per-day pricing. You're going to have to view it more as a project. We call them projects in my company. You have to build in the cost for your prep time. For a remote assignment or a new technology assignment, it may last an hour and a half. But if that hour and a half is, say, urological surgery, which we've done, you're going to have to build in a whole lot of cost for prep time. And I don't recommend an hourly rate for a number of reasons. If you get into an hourly rate, then clients they want to see the value that they're getting for each hour. A project approach, I think, is a much safer approach and gives you more flexibility. I strongly believe that. It also gives you some a legal basis for being a contractor and an independent entity as opposed to an employee model. Insurance is another one. How many of you here are in the private market versus institutional? Okay, fantastic. How many of you have general liability insurance? Fantastic. That would not be the case in the United States. That number of hands. Say that again.
My insurance company excludes states from the United States.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Okay, but I'm so thrilled that you have it. Workers' comp is a little different in Europe, but I would ask that of people in America as well. And how many of you have errors and omissions insurance? Fantastic. Yes, as interpreters. There are, yes, even for interpreters, it's highly recommended. And there are insurance companies that cater to the language industry. and the costs are really not that high. So you might find yourself in a position going forward where you're asked to provide a certificate of insurance. I actually ask every interpreter that is hired through our company for a certificate of insurance, and if you don't have it, you have to sign a waiver. That it's not required by law in your jurisdiction or domicile or where you live. Business licenses is another thing that we have to have in the US. It may be a little bit different in Europe. But creating yourselves as a business entity, I think, is really important, because this gives you the leverage to start pushing that liability and risk back onto the client. Because what is the purpose of a contract? The purpose of a contract is to limit your liability and risk. That's the purpose of a contract. So you want to focus on the paragraphs in those contracts that push your risk and liability to somebody else. Everybody should have a best human effort clause. That's something that's in all of our contracts with interpreters. Interpretation it's a service, but it's actually a product. That interpretation is a best human effort. It in no way is an edited translation. It in no way guarantees or promises to be perfect. And everybody needs to have a clause. You can talk to your legal counsel about this. I'm happy to provide samples as well. Everybody needs a best human effort clause in their contract. You need clauses that push that liability away from you. Fair and reasonable risk is something that you should be responsible for, and you can list these things in the contract. You can say, I will provide a headset microphone that meets these standards from Klaus's list. I will provide a dedicated computer. I love this idea of a dedicated computer. I think that's super, super important. You can actually list the things that you're going to provide, and this will help you limit your risk. I will guarantee that I will have these items that meet these standards, but even these items can fail. Your computer can fail, your microphone can fail, and by the way, the microphone is always the number one fail point. The cables in a microphone, I always recommend having a backup. Have a couple. Don't just have one. You can get a really good ISO standard microphone for not that much money. So if you list these items that you're going to provide, and you have paragraphs that talk about fair and reasonable risk, you can only guarantee certain things. You cannot guarantee things that are outside of your reasonable control. And this word reasonable is really important to have in there too. So acting like a business, having these contracts, specifying these, all of these things are important. Training is another issue. I'd love to see interpreters get more training on remote platforms. Every single company that's been mentioned today, these tech companies, they all will provide free training to interpreters. It would be great, even if you have no intention of working with this company, just to try out their platform, get familiar with it, see what's involved. All of this is open to all of you. It doesn't in any way suggest that you're going to work with them or commit to working with them, but it does arm you with a lot of knowledge and prepare you should you wish to work that way. I really believe that the companies that are going to be successful, the technology companies that are going to be successful, and by the way, I was supposed to have a slide up, but that's okay, it didn't come up. Can you bring it up? It's the Atlas. It's similar to what Sarita had. We'll see if we can get it up. I believe, no, it's just one slide. That the companies that are going to be successful, these tech companies, are the ones that are going to bridge the gap between the conventional way of doing things and the hardware world and the software world. Klaus said that when this Verso tactile station was brought up, everybody applauded. And I'm so not surprised, because bridging that gap between the hardware only and that software world. It's very difficult for an interpreter to suddenly have a computer. What if your screen goes blank and your computer goes to sleep? How do you mute yourself? Okay, this is a slide. Everybody can access this through nimsy.com. This is the language technology landscape, and this maps over 400 tech companies in the language space right now. Many of these have to do with translation, some voice recognition, interpreting is over there on the right, but just because interpreting is a smaller section does not mean that everybody should not pay attention to the left-hand side, because artificial intelligence and the movement towards machine interpretation is being driven by speech and voice recognition technology and machine translation. So these things are very important to pay attention to, but I'm sure a lot of the people are having their breath taken away by the scope of how many companies there are out there in this space who are active. And this is not everybody. Not everybody is on here. I've been talking to a number of companies who aren't on here. But I firmly believe that the ones who are going to be the most successful right now are what I call the gap bridgers. And that brings me to the fact that we're here to talk about remote. But don't forget that there are other new technology solutions and companies who aren't doing remote. Linguali is one of those companies, and they're very successful right now. They're providing a new technology, BYOD, on-site solution with an interpreter station that is a computer software station. And they're doing very large events on a regular basis. 2,000 listeners, 1,500 listeners, 1,000 listeners, Paris, Abu Dhabi, you name it. They're all over the place. They did a big meeting in Thailand recently, 2,000 listeners in 20 languages, I believe. There are other companies that are also bridging this gap. There's a company in Austria that had 16 languages and 6,500 listeners, and the interpreters were on site, but it was new technology. So I call these companies the gap bridgers. Interactio is another one of these companies. They started out by providing a BYOD solution, but the interpreters were on site. They're moving into remote now. But these companies are the ones to pay attention to because they are bridging that gap. I love the hub model. I think the hub model is a fantastic solution for the right situation. And I think that it is a viable alternative that needs to be explored. And the concept of having interpreters create those hubs, to me, is a fantastic idea. As I mentioned, I'm unable to do that right now. So I'm looking for other ways to pursue the hub model. So Rochelle and I are going to be having more of a talk. So standards is another issue that needs to be thought about in terms of operating yourselves as a business. I'm going to say something provocative, but I think it needs to be said and it's important. Everybody in this room cares tremendously about standards. I am a champion of standards for interpreters. One of the biggest problems that my company has had in the 46 years that we've been in business is that the market doesn't really care about standards. The clients don't care and don't know. Most clients don't even know that there are ISO standards. If they know what ISO standards are, they don't know that there are ISO standards for interpreting. And educating the clients about these standards is very important. There is another standards organization called the ASTM. It is based in America, but it is global. And it is trying to focus on market-driven standards as opposed to the technical standards. It incorporates technical standards, but it's trying to focus on what's viable in the market from the client's perspective. So it's trying to create minimum standards for operating procedures and this sort of thing. And the ASTM is actually trying to create a certification for language service companies, which I think is a fantastic idea. So there are standards out there. Getting those conveyed to the clients is a very challenging thing. And I love that Klaus put standards in his contract and talks to the clients about them, I think that's absolutely fantastic. And the more talk about the standards, the more education we can provide to the clients about standards. So it's very important, but don't forget that to a great extent, the market doesn't care about standards. And that's a little bit of a scary thing. So in conclusion, I want to say that everybody's afraid of commoditizing simultaneous and conference interpreting. And that's a valid fear. So my approach is maintain the focus on the human element and focus on commoditizing both the technology and the business model approach to providing the service instead of commoditizing the talent. So focus on commoditizing the right things, and over time we can educate the market about what's the important focus for commoditization. I'm going to finish up with a couple of quotes. Most of you have probably heard this before, but my father was quoted many years ago: interpreters will not be replaced by technology. They will be replaced by interpreters who use technology. It's still incredibly valid today, that quote. And I hope that everybody in this room will view the future as a source of opportunity with changing and new and exciting markets, and not a threat. That being said, not every technology solution up here is a good thing. So we have to be educated. We have to explore. We have to understand what these companies are doing. We have to provide them with feedback and tell them if we think they're doing something wrong. We need to let them know and tell them how to do it right. And having that dialogue with these companies is incredibly important, and everybody in this room can help participate in that. I know some of you have reached out to Interprify and not gotten responses, and I'm going to let them hear it about that. That's not okay. So in conclusion, I just want to say it's your obligation, in my opinion, to be compatible with the future. I've told this to hardware companies. In order to succeed, you need to be compatible with the future, but it holds true for interpreters as well. So working together, I think that we can all do that. Thank you very much.